Hi everyone, it's Lindsay, and today I'm going to be doing some more Bible journaling. This time I'm going to be working in 2 Timothy chapter 2 verses 1 through 5. I'll be using this stamp set from Joy Clair stamps. It's from their Color by Faith series, and it is called God's Army. I'm going to be using all of these different colors of distress ink on my card today. And I'm first going to start out by doing a little bit of distress ink blending on the sides of my pages. Now this is a little tricky when you're working with your Bible pages because they don't want you to rub over them at all. The crinkle up, you can see I just did it in the top right hand corner. So what I did was I first started out with some antique linen. It's a very light distress ink. It hardly shows up. You really have to layer this up to get any color out of it. And it has its uses. I love it, don't get me wrong. So what I started to do with that was I needed to put a layer of that down so I had some blendability over the top of that. So I'm using a pouncing motion here. I'm just dipping it in my distress ink off to the right there, and then I pounce in a circular motion over the edges of my Bible page that I'm working on. And that is going to allow me to build up that color, and that will allow other colors to sit on top of that. And because distress ink stays wet for a little bit, it's going to allow those colors to blend out a little bit better. If I were to have went in straight with this vintage photo that I'm working with now, it would have turned out to be quite a mess. I would have gotten hard edges and everything else, but putting that layer down underneath it really gives it a little bit more blendability. And especially when I'm using this pouncing motion, it works out much better this way. So with my vintage photo, I am taking off most of the excess of the ink on the right hand side on that paper. So I'm doing that each and every time before I bring it to my page. Then I just pounce it right over the top of that antique linen until I'm getting a very nice darker distressed edge of my page. And I'm using this on the outer edge. I brought the antique linen in a little bit more closer to the words, but the vintage photo I'm leaving on the very outer edges. I'm barely taking it in the center of the page at all. Now I am keeping away from my words. I don't want to cover any of those up. I'm just doing around the edges. Now for this stamp set, it's got some little pieces in it where if you stamp them in different colors, you can get a camo background. So that's what I'm doing. I'm using Mowed Lawn. I'm using that same vintage photo, but it's going to look a little bit different whenever I stamp it because I'm using it as a solid image and not sponging it on. It gives a nice dark image. I'll also use some Walnut Stain, which is a dark brown. It's more of a black undertone brown. I'll go ahead and use that. I'm using this, I think it's called Crushed Olive. The last word is olive. I use so many and I have so many distress inks. I get the names mixed up. I used to know all of them, but my brain's too full anymore these days. I'm also using some Black Soot, which is a very dark, rich black color, so I'm using it more sparingly. I'm also using a little bit of Hickory Smoke, which is a gray color, and that really allows me to blend in with that black as well. Now, whenever I'm stamping these, I am connecting them together. If you look at any pictures of camo online, you'll notice that they're all bunched together, all of these pieces. It doesn't spread out. So I'm connecting each piece and kind of overlapping them as I stamp along. Now, as I was going, I wasn't happy with the way it was looking just so stark against the background. So what I decided to do was I actually ended up taking all of these pieces when I was done, the same pieces I had used to stamp the camo with, and I used some of that antique linen, which is the very light dye ink, and I stamped over all of those camo pieces that I had stamped beforehand. And that blended them all together. It gave them a nice kind of background against that white paper. So it ended up looking much better once I stamped those over the top. I also used the dog tags and I stamped those in the top right hand corner and I masked those off. I wanted those to be able to write in later on to remember what verses I was going off of with my journaling page. So I'll use those to write in later on, but I want some camo stamped around them to make it look like they're popping up from the background. So I mask those off very quickly with some Inkadinkado masking paper, and then I'll just continue to stamp this background and go right over the top of that mask, and once I pull it up, those dog tags will be nice and clean underneath, and there won't be any ink on them whatsoever. Now, whenever I was stamping this, I did make sure to stay away from those words. This distress ink, if you add water to it, it does become transparent, and some of the lighter colors are more transparent, but with the darker colors I was using, it will cover up some of those words, especially with your blacker or your black soot and your walnut stain. That will cover up your words. So I just stayed completely away from them and just worked on the edges of the page. Now here's where I added in that antique linen kind of background stamping with all of these different pieces, and this just kind of allowed me to tie in all of these pieces, make it look more cohesive, and really give it more of a camo effect instead of just being up against that stark white background. Once I had that done, I wanted to go ahead and watercolor in my little dog tags here. I wanted to keep the dog tags looking more silver, so I took some of my Perfect Pearls, and this is in the pearl color. I added a little bit of water to it, and then I'll just mix them up, and a little bit of hickory smoke too for that gray color. Mix that all up and colored right over the top of those dog tags. Using very little of this color because if you use too much water, it's going to warp your pages. Now, Joy Clair Stamps, which is who I designed for, they have every month for their design team a technique that they want us to focus on. This month is bling, and I don't do bling well. I use more of a clean and simple style, so I really struggled with this and how to incorporate it. So I decided to try something that I've never tried before, and that is heat embossing in my Bible journaling. I've seen people on the design team do it. They do it beautifully, but I've never done it, so this was kind of a risk for me. So I took the sentiment from the set, and I'm going to stamp that in the right margin with Versamark ink. Now, before I even stamp this, I did use my heat tool to completely dry this page because Distress ink stays wet for a long time. And if you put embossing powder over any of that, Distress ink is a beautiful ink to use if you want to heat emboss. But in this case, I didn't want it sticking to any of that. So I did use my heat gun to make sure everything was nice and dry. I used my embossing bag to prep my surface. And then I went ahead and stamped that sentiment, poured on some silver embossing powder, and at first I was like, oh no, what have I done? Because it completely disappeared. But once I heat set it, it made it pop out from the page, gave it that shine, and I am so glad that we have to do these techniques because this is not something I would have done, and I am so happy with the results. Now, I like this sentiment so much, I wanted to add more. So what I decided to do was I used my embossing bag over the entire page, and then I brought it back out those camo stamps that I used beforehand. Now I put my paper back underneath to protect my pages behind this page that I'm working on, and I went ahead and started stamping some of these camo stamps that I used beforehand and filling in some empty spaces that I had. I'm using Versamark ink here, and then I'm going to heat emboss these for a little bit of that extra shine too. Now I decided to use silver and gold embossing powder to kind of tie in with the blacks and the browns I was using. So I'm first going to be using that same silver that I used beforehand. This is a Stampin' Up! Powder that I'm using. Any silver will do. And then I'm coming back in with my heat tool, and I'll heat set all of those. I didn't add very many of these. I didn't want to overtake the page with them, but I did like that shine that the sentiment gave. I love the effect, so I wanted to add more of that. So there I've got those nice silver shiny pieces of the camo, and then I'll come in with more of that Versamark ink, and I did prep my surface again with my embossing bag just off camera. I'll stamp a few more of these, spacing them out a little bit and just filling them in here and there, and then I'll come in with some Princess Gold embossing powder from Ranger. Now this is more of a yellow gold instead of your straight gold, so it's very pretty and very shiny, and it goes along with the browns very well. So I'll go ahead and sprinkle this over those stamps. dust off that excess, and I just put a piece of paper underneath that to catch all the excess, and then put it right back in the container. And then I'll go ahead and heat set these as well and make sure they are nice and melted down so nothing flies off the page. And had I not had this technique that I needed to use with my design team, I never would have done this. So again, I am so glad that we have these kind of challenges in our design team to use these different techniques, because it just opens up new doors for me too. Now I felt like my sentiment was getting a little lost after I added those other shiny elements. So what I decided to do was I brought out my micron pen and just added shadows to it. And that's going to help it stick out from that page and just help the sentiment kind of jump off and really stand out against all of this camo that's going on in the background. Now, if you were a planner, you could mask off like a little circle and stamp the camo around that for your sentiment, but I'm not. I just kind of go with it and let things go where they might. I don't plan anything really anymore, so I have to work around my mistakes. Now I decided to add a little bit of splatter, so I'm using the fireworks spray in the tuxedo black. This is from Imagine Crafts, and I just sprayed a little on acrylic black, dipped in my paintbrush, covered up my words so I didn't get any on that because it will black them out, and then just splattered that on with that paintbrush. And that finished off the page for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this. It was kind of one big experiment, but I had fun making it. As always, I'm going to leave you guys with a few pictures of this finished page. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a few different links you can click on. The top will take you to a video that you might enjoy watching next. The bottom left will take you to the supply list for this card, and the bottom right will subscribe you to my channel. Thank you guys so much for watching today, and happy crafting!